Thank you so much for having me here today. As was alluded to, yes, I've had the privilege of working with Springfield City Group 14 years now. One of the first things we were working on was around the hospital in the initial discussions with Marta, and what was at the time a very challenging discussion around the potential for a 10-bed day hospital. And that was where things were being pitched at, and part of the challenge and or opportunity with Springfield historically has always been about communicating and having people understand what the growth story and the growth potential around Springfield has been. What is different now 14 years later is that growth story is a lived experience. And the nature of the challenges in terms of finding partners for supporting the growth of the city into the future is less about understanding the scale of the growth, the speed of the growth, but more about understanding the content and the character and the attributes that sit within that growth, and where are the pressure points as well as the opportunities that are emerging across a range of fronts. And education and in the schooling sector is absolutely one of the critical components to that story, and it has been so far and will continue to be. I think one of the interesting things when we look at the population of the area, as was mentioned, 55,000 people within Springfield City. The population has grown year on year for the best part of the last 15 years at 6% per annum. It has been forecast by QGSO to slow down every single time the QGSO has done a set of projections, and every single time it has not slowed down, to the point now where it has been consistently growing for the best part of the last 15 years at 4 times the national average. That is a full decoupling of growth in this corridor compared to a lot of the state and national trends we see. And so there is a significant concentration of growth activity. And a big part of that has been driven by a highly aspirational, highly economically engaged population, particularly couples and family with children who are seeking a lifestyle as well as accessibility to economic opportunities. And you can see that through some of the population figures. The scale of the growth going forward, the population here, it's only just halfway through its population growth profile, as we've seen to 2046. So it's about 50,000 people now, projected to be 100,000 people in the city over the course of by 2046. What is interesting in particular within that, as I mentioned before, about the content of the population, is that we see, looking around the country, an ageing profile moving its way very heavily through the demographics of a lot of the areas around, and even growth areas that are experiencing strong growth. And you can see even in places such as Springfield City, where you have 55, 64, 64 plus, quite small percentages now, around 5% of the population is age 65 plus. It's going to be 5 times bigger as a total number of people over the next 20 years. So a significant growth. The difference is, though, is that every other demographic is growing as well. And that's the difference. The share of 65 plus is definitely going to get bigger. It goes from 5% to 10%, but that's well below the current 18% in Queensland, going to well over 1 in 4 people aged 65 plus. So yes, you can have growth, but the demographics that sit within that growth are incredibly important to understand the drawdown of facilities and services, infrastructure, as well as the demand for goods and services generally. So this character of being rapidly growing and sustaining that growth over time, but maintaining a somewhat perennially young population profile because of the relationship between the population and the economy, is so important to understand when we talk about the story of Springfield. The other element, the interrelationship between the economy and the population, is borne out through the prosperity of the population and its level of economic engagement. This is a place where there is wealth that is being generated, and that wealth that is being generated is being done so because of an incredibly engaged population when it comes to economic participation, business creation, and employment. This is a place where people come to work and to live and to establish lives, and having that aspirational. And I think one of the interesting things when we look at some of the data going forward, one of the interesting things about the demographics, the socioeconomics around Springfield, is that it is very homogenous from a values perspective. It's actually an incredibly diverse population, socioethnically, in terms of place of origin, in terms of language. but the values that sit within a lot of these communities and a lot of the households about what are they seeking from their life here in Springfield is very uniform, and that is they're here to work, they're here to run businesses, they're here to generate wealth, and they're here to have an upwardly mobile aspiration for their children. And that's borne out through the incomes, which are structurally across the board higher than that of the national average for all suburbs. So this is not just a Brookwater story. This is a structural story that exists across all of the Springfield city area. And we have unemployment rates that have been structurally half that of the state average, if not lower, now for the entirety of the project's existence. So this has, from the very beginning, been a low unemployment area with very high labour force participation amongst both men and women in households, and importantly, is also a young population. So you're seeing these compounding effects economically that are happening. Younger population means there's a bigger workforce for the size of the population. That workforce is economically engaged and also has a lower unemployment rate. That cascades through to the levels of socioeconomic aspiration that we've seen in the population to date. It's also borne out by the skills profile of the population. So we're seeing 4 in 10 people with post-school qualifications have bachelors and above, which is above the state average. It's one of the things Queensland, as a profile, as a trend, has always had a slightly lower level of a bachelor and higher post-school qualifications. Springfield bucks that trend. And you can see that in the fact that there is a significant attraction of businesses, investment, industry to Springfield on the back of the number one constraint to business operations going forward into the future, and that is skilled workers. Nothing else, and even in the we can see in this post-COVID environment, when we've seen a significant acceleration in the baby boomer generation retiring on the back of that, and how that's crunched the labour force, and how we've been in this situation of where the economy has, quote unquote, slowed, and yet we're at unemployment rates of 4%. Why is that? It's because it's not a cyclical shortfall of workers, it's a structural shortfall. And even with the significant immigration that we've had, nowhere near enough to fill the prospects of population of skills demand going forward in the future. And Springfield is something of a microcosm of that phenomenon because of the concentration of those skilled workers in the area. The other thing that we're noticing is that when it comes to those top sort of 5% jobs, high-skilled, ICT, engineering, sciences, there is a cluster of those skills that are living within Springfield City that are accelerating in terms of their demand. There's about 1,200 people who are in the top 1 to 5% of skilled jobs in the economy that are living here in that part of the Springfield economy. That's expected to reach over 3,000 within the next 10 years. So this, again, there's this compounding effect of the relationship between the economy, the population, and the skills and the business requirements for businesses going forward. And that's also reflected in the fact that it's an incredibly entrepreneurial population. There's a value set in the community across all demographics, across all socioethnic groups around coming to Springfield, being aspirational to send your kids to high quality schools so that they can achieve higher outcomes in their lives, setting up and running businesses from this location, being involved in significant tertiary level services and businesses and infrastructure, to the point where we've now reached something of a turning point of Springfield where the economy, despite 6% population growth year on year, the economy is growing faster than the population. So over the last 4 years, we've seen a 50% increase in the number of registered businesses here in Springfield, far exceeding that of the national and state growth in businesses in the area, as you can see. But even with the fast population growth, which 1 in 5 people who live in Springfield now arrived in the last 4 years. So even despite that growth, the business registrations profile has been even faster, and it has not slowed down. We saw this post-COVID bump when everybody realised, oh, hey, I can go and do my job from home and I don't need to have go into the office every day. We saw that bump happen in a lot of places, and then it's plateaued. That's not the case in Springfield. We've seen this acceleration. And part of the reason for that is that Springfield, as an economic destination, is starting to overtake its role as a population and residential destination of choice. And that's because as a principal activity centre, as it was always designated to be, it's designed and planned to service a population catchment of up to 500,000 people. And that population catchment is leveraging critical regionally and state significant infrastructure and services, but also major transport networks, roads and rail that bring people from outside of Springfield into Springfield. And the concentration, the clustering of tertiary health, tertiary education, of transport, as well as the growth in jobs and businesses is creating this pull effect when it comes to skills. When it comes to how people are, what skills they're attaining, what's their relationship between business, industry, post-school education systems, and increasingly interfacing into the school system itself, and what does that transition look like? I'll give you an example. At the moment, there's an increasing trend of businesses who are just bypassing graduates and going straight into unis. And I know because I'm one of them. 80% of my staff I hired when they were a second-year uni student. Then they work part-time, and have had a couple of them graduate who are now full-time, and they've exited from their university studies full-time with 2 years' worth of applied business experience. These weren't internships, these weren't work experience, these were paid employment positions that people are doing because skill shortages. How do you get the skills? Well, you have to go in earlier. If this trend continues, the pathway, and we can see this in other parts of the world, of where the relationship for major businesses is to go straight to school and have those interrelationships and those partnerships with schools directly to build the workforce and skills pipelines needed to generate the workforce needed to support those businesses and industries into the future. That's just a matter of time. We're already seeing those strong interrelationships being formed with the universities, with TAFE around the state and around the country, between industry and the post-school education sector. The secondary school is only a matter of time until that becomes not just a best practice, but the norm. When a kid is at year 10 or year 9 and they're making those starting to make those genuine pathway decisions, the role that business and industry is going to play in influencing and or having a partnership approach with secondary schools in that journey is going to become more and more the norm, not the exception. And so when we look at Springfield, the drivers of it as a place are very unique. Sustained rapid population that's maintained, that remains perennially young, but with an economic growth profile that is increasingly outpacing that of the population because of the exposure to the surrounding area. That interrelationship between the wider catchment and the transport networks, that mean just because you have a catchment doesn't matter unless the people can get to the activity centre that is Springfield. And that's something that Springfield has to its advantage. The same thing with the dynamic business and investment. I work around the country with a lot of economies, a lot of local regions, and the number one challenge is this place needs growth or we're going to die. That's the number one message I receive when I go travel around, particularly in regional areas or in suburban areas where we're a dormitory suburb, we've got no economic assets or no economic attributes to us, our population is aging, this place is dying with our population. The uniqueness of working with Springfield is that it's the exact opposite, which is the economy is outgrowing that of the population and going into surrounding areas. The importance of the relationship between lifestyle, amenities, sporting facilities, and those types of things to population, to have people who are economically engaged but still have lifestyle outlets in a community is incredibly important, not just as a residential destination, but as a business attraction and as an opportunity for the supporting of major infrastructure, including major tertiary infrastructure, where there is already a cluster of of schools, but also in terms of hospitals, and you can see the expansion of the Mater Hospital at the moment, but also in the university space. So what does this mean then for schools? The Springfield, to summarise the message as it relates to schools within Springfield and the opportunities around schools within Springfield from this narrative is that the opportunity for the play for Springfield is one of Springfield as a destination for a wider catchment growth, and that the scale of that growth means that the opportunities that are arising of a more specialist, more niche, more targeted nature around schooling is becoming increasingly not only viable but needed to represent and reflect the diversity of opportunities and diversity of demand for skills and of the population character of the area. We were engaged last year by Springfield City Group to look at the profile of school demand going forward into the future and to understand that interrelationship between Springfield as a school's destination and that wider catchment that is projected to be almost 400,000 people. And so you can see here we've a couple of catchments, Springfield itself, including Bellbird Park, adjacent to it. But obviously, as was mentioned before, we have these corridors that extend up through Camira. We have this corridor that goes out to Ripley, this corridor that goes out following that road network. And we know from the way in which the school catchments are defined from a public perspective, as well as the enrolment flows from a private and a non-government perspective, that there is a significant draw of those populations into Springfield. As I just mentioned, we look at population within Springfield and we say there's 50,000 people here. But the population of Springfield from an economic perspective is actually 150,000 people at the moment. So 2 in every 3 people who rely upon Springfield economically don't live here. They live in the surrounding catchment. And the difference is that even though Springfield's population is going to double over the next 25 years, 20 to 25 years, 3 in 4 people by 2046 who rely upon Springfield will be living outside of Springfield. That is the story of Springfield going forward. Springfield as a place that services a wider catchment, 400,000 people plus by 2046. These are from QGSO projections, and I can tell you from my experience over the last 20 years worth in government, outside of government, that they've been conservative in every single release. And I get it, because the idea of sustaining 6% year-on-year growth forever, at some point in time it's going to slow. It just hasn't yet. And it keeps going, and the sustainability and the maintenance of that growth is what makes a very unique story for Springfield. The wider catchment shares a lot of attributes with that of Springfield when it comes to its population profile and its demographic profile. You can see that the red bars there, which is the entire catchment, is disproportionately young compared to that of Brisbane and the wider Ipswich LGAs and also compared to the state. And that's because of that very strong focus on economic participation, and so you've got a lot of 2-income households with kids who are living here, who are choosing to come here, no longer just as first home buyers, but increasingly as second and third home buyers, seeking that residential destination of choice. That flows through the area, but it's also that's translating into areas like Ripley. That's translating into areas like Greenbank. That's translating to areas around Springfield as well, because the ability to buy into Springfield for a lot of households is becoming increasingly difficult, stock-wise and affordability-wise, because this is a premium place, as an aspirational place. So people who are going, well, I'm going to go to Ripley and then I'm going to send my kids to a school in Springfield. That is a very genuine, legitimate decision when you look at Springfield as a city that services a future 400,000 population catchment. One of the big lessons from stage 1 of the Mater Hospital was the lack of a maternity offering. It was a huge issue. As somebody who was involved in those business cases, it was a recommendation from the very beginning and recognised by state and Mater as being a real opportunity cost that wasn't there. And there's a reason that there is a public maternity offering going into Springfield, not just because the fertility rates and the number of births within Springfield itself continue to remain very strong, despite high levels of female workforce participation, but because there's a lot of people in that 400,000 into the future who are being born right now and into the future. And so one of the things that we can see is that while you're seeing a decline in fertility rates across the country, you're seeing an aging of the population, real headwinds for the growth of schooling needs into the future across the country or even across the state. That's not the case in Springfield. It is the exception in some cases that proves the rule elsewhere in the state and in the country. One of the other interesting factors when you look at the population is the fact that it is it is demographically and from a household composition perspective quite homogenous. It is a family destination, residential destination of choice, couple families with children being the overwhelmingly predominant sort of household that exists within the primary and also to an extent within the secondary catchment as well. Even though the secondary catchment, you can see the influence of some of the established suburbs within the secondary catchment. But if you break that down even further and looking at places like Ripley, looking at Newbeath and Greenbank and other areas that are still experiencing very strong growth, even heading down to Flagstone, you can see that young couple family with children profile is disproportionately represented within the area. As I mentioned before, one of the really interesting parts of Springfield, I remember when we first started working in the project and we were looking at 2006 census data, and it was the first time the socioeconomics within Springfield had actually gone above the average nationally. Before that, it was slightly below, but it was slightly below with 2-income households and high economic resources, and it was because there was a bunch of young people who were at the early stage of their careers. This was never a low socioeconomic area. This was a young area of people who were starting their careers and starting their journeys. And since then, we've seen that transition of being, as you saw before in Springfield City, the higher incomes and the higher household incomes. You can also see, however, how the extent to which there is a duality that exists within the secondary catchment of those established suburbs, some of which are older, some of which have lower incomes, as well as newer suburbs like Ripley that is effectively replicating the Springfield demographic. Whereas you've got unemployment, where the population is growing incredibly rapidly, some cases with year on year 10, 15% growth, depending on the level of land release, yet maintaining unemployment rates 3% plus, sub 3%. You can only do that if every person who's coming there is disproportionately more employed and more engaged in the labour force than would otherwise be the case. And that's a huge driver for the area. And as I said before, one of the big factors in this is with regards to the employment rate and the unemployment rate. And you can see that, even compared to the Brisbane LGA, which has the highest level of employment access within southeast Queensland, this area here in the primary catchment is an extremely economically engaged area. And we're also seeing some of the trends of that convergence happening with other areas around Springfield as well, where you're seeing a much greater level of economic participation emerging in some of the growth areas. So what does this mean for schools? We wanted to look at schools from a very holistic perspective across all different sectors, so not just government versus non-government, but also to start to understand where those fragmentation opportunities, those niche particular opportunities based on specific drivers are coming forward in Springfield, and what's the scale and critical mass of those opportunities, to understand where are their investment milestones or investment triggers that are likely to come forward into the future. So one of the things we did, we looked at that 5 to 19 population profile and we compared that to sort of the enrolments to get an understanding of the relationship. So the current enrolment to youth ratio in Springfield is 105%. So there's 105 school places for every 100 kids or 100 people aged 5 to 19 within Springfield. So this area is already servicing a population that well exceeds that of the local demographic. It's already servicing a population that is coming into the area, and that is expected to continue to grow into the future. As I said, 3 in 4 people who rely upon Springfield for services, including schooling, in 20 years' time are going to be living outside of the Springfield city boundaries. And so that's where not only is there growth locally, it's that growth that is occurring, the critical massive demand that's occurring in the surrounding area. We can see that when we look at the ratios, as I said, starting at 100 to 105, expected to get up to 115%. So more and more people are going to be outside of Springfield, but drawing down upon Springfield schooling as their location preference. And so this results in where we're seeing at the moment, which is, as of 2023, there's latent demand sitting there of around 14,500 places. So what it suggests is that even now there was an undersupply in total schooling places within the Springfield area as of 2023, 2024 of between, up to 1,000 places. So people who otherwise would come here are going elsewhere because of capacity constraints in a number of the schools or challenges we saw with COVID in terms of delaying expansions to schools and other projects. Also, the impact that capital cost escalations and construction cost escalations have had, and that's having an impact in terms of creating a pent-up demand. But that's just now. As of the next sort of 20 years, there's an additional 10,000 students who want to come here, who are being generated out of that population in the surrounding area. And that even includes and considers the significant investment that's expected in areas like Ripley, in other parts of Greenbank and down to Flagstone, in schooling in those areas. So this is not suggesting, if anything, Springfield's role under this scenario actually decreases within the wider catchment because of that decentralised response to schooling. So even with that response, even with all those projected investments occurring in other areas, there's still another 10,000 students that need to be accommodated within Springfield over the course of the next 20 years. And as was mentioned earlier, the traditional model in which you can take 6 hectares or 12 hectares and build a 1,500 to 1,800 person optimally sized public school or government school with the supporting infrastructure. One, that's bloody hard to do anywhere in the state at the moment, and Trent will absolutely advocate for that point. But it's also increasingly difficult to do in urban areas that have significant growth profile going forward into the future. And this is a lesson that we sort of need to understand, not just in Springfield, but across Southeast Queensland, is how do you deliver primary and secondary education solutions for activity centres that are servicing growing areas that have populations that in some cases are doubling within a 20-year period. How do we do that? The models are changing and have to change in response to that. What it also reflects is that there is a critical mass of demand that is driving really unique and diverse opportunities that's seeing the traditional sort of almost like monoculture type approach to schooling fragment with a diversity of more unique targeted opportunities. I've had, and I don't believe they're here today, I've had an opportunity to work with the Sycamore College over in Sycamore School in the Redlands area, and with the school there that is obviously designed specifically to cater for and or build education programs around people who are suffering from autism or having alternative learning models that are linked to being on the ASD spectrum. That is a perfect example of where we're seeing opportunities for targeted, tailored schooling start to emerge because of the critical mass of demand, not just across Southeast Queensland, but increasingly within areas like Springfield, where there is that significant growth and demand for schooling. We're seeing in an area like Springfield a disproportionate drawdown on independent schools and non-government school enrolments, that aspiration for schooling, and particularly strong in the multicultural nature of this population. I think that's an incredibly interesting thing and important thing to understand, is that this is a multicultural population that bucks the stereotypes, the intergenerational stereotypes of low socioeconomic, low levels of economic integration, low levels of social integration. This is the opposite. This is the epitome, in many cases, of an economically engaged multicultural society. And with that comes a uniformity of shared values, of aspiration of educational outcomes for your kids. And that's a very different, that's not a uniform view across society as a whole, but it is a shared value here. And that's actually where the homogeneity comes from. It's not from age, it's not from socioeconomics, it's from values. And that veers very heavily when we talk about things such as non-government school enrolments, which basically now have reached a point where there's a need for at least 2 more 1,500 plus P to 12 schools within Greater Springfield of a primary nature within the next sort of 20 years. And we all know how hard it is to plan schools and then deliver schools. So the reality is we're already well behind on the non-government school front when it comes to the growth. And considering that the growth potential of the existing schools is increasingly limited, there's some expansion plans, but there's either space constraints or there's just operational optimal sizing constraints that a number of the schools have reached maturity. So what is the solution there? Well, what it shows is that this growth rate is faster than the growth rate for schools generally because of that socioeconomic mix and how that's flowing through to school aspirations. One of the other things that we're seeing is that there is still an incredibly strong demand for single gender schools, single sex schools, both from an all boys and all girls school. When you ask parents what their preferences are, it continues to be an overwhelming preference, even though as a model it hasn't been delivered in Queensland or even in Australia for the best part of the last decade. And part of the reason for that is viability of critical mass. You're halving your catchment size. The moment you take a single gender school, you halve your catchment size. And because of that, in a lot of places, it's not a viable option when you're talking about infrastructure payback periods that are 20, 30 years in duration. What is interesting is that Springfield's actually one of the few locations where that model is actually incredibly viable in terms of underlying demand because of the scale of the population, where you're starting to see solutions that are to that growing demand for non-government schools within the area that can take on multiple forms. One of those is relating to sex and gender, but you've also starting to see more of the specialist nature of school opportunities becoming viable considerations here. If you look at modelling the projections of the neurodiverse student enrolments within the total school enrolment, at the moment there is over 800 students that are diagnosed neurodiverse that are in schools in Springfield, and that's expected to grow to over 1,500. That's a school. That's a school size cohort of children who are neurodivergent and who would benefit and have been shown to benefit from not just tailored curriculum responses, but also tailored infrastructure and facilities responses to maximise their schooling outcomes to all of our benefits. There is nothing more valuable as someone who's worked in innovation than someone who thinks differently to you. It can be confronting, but it is economically the most important driver of innovation. And so when you look at successful people, entrepreneurs around the country, around the world, what do they often demonstrate is a level of high level or propensity for neurodiversity. So how do we not only cater for this group to meet their needs as a growing school cohort, but recognise that the economic potential of this cohort as it flows through from a skills profile is maximised when we can tailor the schooling opportunities to them rather than have tried to make them respond to us. And be able to do that in a critical mass way, similar to what Sycamore and others have done, provides that from an infrastructure sunk cost perspective, not just from a servicing perspective. One of the interesting things around the schooling, school cohort within Springfield is the diversity of faith presenting. The level of socio-ethnic diversity, the multiculturalism that exists within Springfield is unique as a growth area, particularly when it comes to the values. And but what we see is a strong concentration of different faiths that are and have communities that are part of the Springfield story and of the Springfield journey, and have been and continue to be into the future. And what that creates is opportunities for faith-based educational responses that are outside of the traditional cath-ed or traditional, Christian schooling options. And that is a unique opportunity. That is absolutely a unique opportunity, not just for those faith groups or those communities within Springfield, but for Springfield and for the education system as a whole, by creating increased diversity of choice and opportunity. That actually means that Springfield as an education destination becomes even more stark as an attractive location. Language schools, again, correlated with the faith base, is also that higher proportion of people who speak a language other than English at home, and that's it's an incredibly valuable skill set to have. If we're talking about business and industry wanting skills of the future to support their growth, language diversity is incredibly valuable. Businesses that are being set up now are being set up born global, born virtual. They're designed they may be based here in Springfield. Their customer base may be everywhere in the world because they're being built to service a global population. And language is often a critical barrier to that. Written language, but also verbal, oral language, and the cultural aspects that come with that. And so when you have a diversity of the multi-ethnic, the multicultural population that we have here in Springfield, with that comes opportunities for language-based schooling opportunities, whether that's as a part of a traditional schooling model or as a dedicated schooling solution as well. And then the other one, which is very linked to what my earlier comments before related to that technical skills-related opportunity, is where are those specialist skills opportunities, schooling solutions going to emerge here in Springfield into the future. So this is where you're starting to move away from viewing, starting to have sufficient critical mass of demand and of the size of the pie of schooling opportunities here in Springfield to be able to segment from that actual dedicated specialist schooling around technical skills. And by technical, it can be anything from trade all the way through, as we saw before, the growth and scale of those top 5%, top 1% of skills that are disproportionately represented within the Springfield labour force. How does the schooling system increasingly and the schooling offering within Springfield increasingly structure itself in order to enable those skills to be generated in a way that is specialist and targeted? And in a lot of parts of the, and you look at the way in which a lot of these specialist schools from the state or other places around the country, it's required whole of metro, almost critical mass in order to drive demand. Here is the really interesting thing, is that the really interesting part of Springfield is because of that critical mass of demand. Here, because of that exposure to that wider catchment, you're seeing significant opportunity in the specialist schooling, the technical schools, and those interrelationships with not just tertiary education pathways, but directly to business and industry located here and potentially servicing and supporting customers around the world. So Springfield is experiencing rapid growth. I'm pretty sure everybody's aware of that story now. If you weren't aware of that story before you entered, you are very much aware of that story now. The maintenance and sustaining of that growth is what is unique, and the fact that as fast as the population is growing, the economy is growing even faster. There is this constant and growing critical mass of economic activity that is creating this pull factor of demand for skills. And as I said before, the trend of going into uni and finding people is flowing through further and further into, and will become the norm of business and industry reaching into schools and starting to foster that flow through of skills, because that is the number one risk for business and industry operations going forward, is skilled workers. It always has been, but the idea now that you can just go to a market to get a person for a job doesn't work like that. Not if, especially if your market involves 3 people who do the specific thing you want to do across Greater Brisbane or Southeast Queensland. That's not a market. That's a recruitment nightmare. And so what do? You preempt that and address that risk by going into unis, by going into TAFEs, and increasingly going into schools and building a long-term structural pipeline for your workforce. And that interrelationship is becoming really important, and Springfield is at the precipice of that because its principal activity centre role, because it has that exposure to the wider 400,000 people, but because its economy is now growing faster than its already rapidly growing population. And that is a unique driver. And so with that, you have this enrolment demand that is growing faster and faster and is expected to reach well over 25,000 students of demand for places here in Springfield to service that wider population. So ultimately, the Springfield story is not about Springfield anymore. It's about everywhere around Springfield. The great thing is that Springfield is still also expected to double in size. So it is a double whammy of demand that is expected to drive into Springfield, and that there will continue to be, no matter what options are delivered around Springfield to cater for that population, there is still an overwhelming aspirational value set that sees Springfield as an education destination of choice, dovetailed in with it being a residential and an economic destination of choice as well. Thank you very much.